Hey everyone. In this video, I want to talk about how to report a bug or a defect, uh, specifically in Cortex, but realistically, a lot of what I'm going to talk about applies to any software that you use. Um, so the way this video is going to be structured is the first third to a half is going to be on just the general pieces that make up a good bug report or defect report or issue ticket. And then the second two-thirds or second half will be about two different ways that you can find those details and provide those details in Cortex, and some of the ways that we make it really easy to report that information to us for support. Now, if this is your first time on the channel, please go ahead and hit subscribe, like the video if you find the content useful. And if you have any other questions about Cortex, keep in mind that we have two ways you can be involved in a community. First up, we have the Cortex users group every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time. We have a Zoom call where Cortex users and people who are interested in using Cortex alike can talk about their experiences with Cortex, ask questions, and even learn about some of the things that we haven't even released in Cortex yet that we're planning on. And then we also have a Discord server that's intended for, asynchronous communication. It is a support channel. It is an area where we monitor for questions or reports of issues and bugs and that sort of thing. And you can find links to both of those, the Cortex user group and the Cortex community on Discord, down in the video description. So with that, let's talk about what makes up a good bug report just in general. Not Cortex specific, but any software that you're using. This probably goes beyond software as well. But I think of four main components to a bug report. Uh, and I'm calling them system details, reproduction steps, the expected behavior, and the actual behavior. So system, repro, expected, and actual. So let's talk about each one of those. So when I talk about system, I'm talking about obviously the piece of software that you're using, which is probably pretty obvious by where you're submitting the ticket to, but also things like the version of software that you're on, and maybe the types of systems that you're using to run the software. So the operating system you're running it on, or the web browser that you're using for a web-based uh, piece of software. Or if you're running the software yourself on your own systems, are you running it on Windows or are you running it on Linux? So I guess that's operating system. Are you running it in a containerized environment, Docker or Kubernetes or each of the major clouds have their own container runtime systems. Where is the database? Is it in Microsoft SQL Server? Is it in Postgres? That sort of thing. And obviously, some of these are going to be relevant to some pieces of software and irrelevant to other pieces of software. If you're using a SaaS piece of software, browser might be sufficient, and everything else is obviously taken care of by the hosting company, and they're going to know the answers to those questions if they come into play. When it comes to Cortex, Cortex is a self-hosted piece of software. So the operating system and the runtime that Cortex is running on, and the type of um, database that you're using is important as well. If you're using Cortex for Sharewell, the assumption kind of is that you're running on Windows with Microsoft SQL Server for the database. If you're using Cortex for ServiceNow, you might be using MySQL or Postgres for the database backend. You might be using Microsoft SQL Server. That's possible as well. Um, and you might be running the web application in any of a number of different ways. So, depending on the type of software that you're using and the specific way you're running it, some of those questions might be relevant. Some of them might not be. Next, we get into the reproduction steps. This is basically the steps you went through um, before you encountered this error. Uh, and my recommendation is that more is always better. Never just say, I clicked on this page and I got an error. How did you get to that page? Were you logged in? Were you logged in as a particular user? Were you logged in as your user or maybe an administrative user or something like that? Did you go somewhere else first? Did you get to that particular page by going to another page first? So in the case of Cortex for Sharewell, it's a very common pattern to search for a particular business object record and then drill into a related record, maybe a related record from that. That progression is important. We might not have to reproduce exactly those records that you went through, but just that progression of how you went through those steps might be the thing that allows us to find the exact cause of the issue that you're seeing. Whereas if we just went directly to that record, we wouldn't have been able to find it. Next, we have the expected behavior. So this is probably the most important thing that I see missing from a lot of bug reports. I certainly see bug reports where the reproduction steps are maybe condensed or aren't sufficient. There just isn't enough information there. But usually someone indicates that they did something in one form or another. But lots of times people don't express what is expected, right? Uh, and in some cases, it might feel kind of obvious. I did X, Y, and Z, and the system crashed. Well, obviously, the expectation is that the system doesn't crash. But as we're drilling a little bit deeper into what's going on, we might find that the system crashed because there was a piece of information that we were looking for that wasn't there. In the case of, I'll use Cortex for Sharewell as an example. There's something called external data connections, external business objects. If those aren't configured and you try to view a grid of those external business objects, what do you expect to happen? Do you want an error message to come up that says this external business object hasn't been configured yet? Please configure it, something along those lines. Do you want it to redirect back to the page? Do you not want to see those business objects at all, or those searches, or those whatever is using that piece of the system? All of those are perfectly valid use cases, but each one of them provides a little bit different value. We don't want to just hide things that we can't show and then leave you wondering, well, what happened to that thing? I know it was in my system. Did it just disappear? That's bad, right? We don't, being that we provide an archive tool, we absolutely want to reflect that the system has all of the pieces that you expect it to have. But at the same time, there might be some pieces that we just can't do. One steps is another example. One steps automations within the system often change the data of the records. Now we can certainly do that kind of in memory on the client side, and which is what we do. There is a certain mode where you can run certain one steps, but some of those pieces we can't run because the only way that they function is by writing to the database or sending an email, which is I want to say a destructive action. It's not really destructive, but it changes the state of the system, and that's a big no-no for an archive system. So in situations like that, we have questions of, how can we make it still be useful to you, and not make it look like a bug, not make it look like a defect. And then, of course, the actual situation that occurs, which is what are you seeing? This is really important, and a lot of times it's overlooked. Its importance is overlooked because in some cases we might go through the reproduction steps and we might see something that looks odd to us. We go and fix that. We think we've solved the issue. You go and use the updated software, and you find that the bug actually isn't fixed because what we saw is something totally different from what you saw. So we fixed something that we thought was an issue, but we didn't actually fix the issue that you saw. So all four of those components are super important. So that's the system, the reproduction steps, the expected behavior, and the actual behavior. Now, let's take a look at a few things in Cortex. And for this part of the video, I'm actually going to divide it into two specific types of bugs or defects. Um, Ideally, without suggesting that one is more critical than another. But the distinction that I'm going to make is case one, where something behaves differently from what you're expecting. In case two, where you get an actual error message, things like the system crashes, or you get an error message on the screen, you get a message on the screen that indicates that something failed. Um, so I'm going to divide those into two different cases, and I'm going to show how you can find information in Cortex to show uh, those four pieces: the system information, the reproduction steps, the expected outcome, and the actual outcome. So let's flip over to Cortex. Here we go. Uh, First off, I want to show you, regardless of what type of issue you're running into, how you can share with us the system information. One of the ways you can share with us the system information. So I'm actually going to move this up a little bit. In the very bottom left corner, you have information about who you're logged in as and the version that you're running. So you can see here, I'm running 2.0.0-alpha. I'm running an alpha version of 2.0, which isn't released yet. Um, and we also have a specific build number. So that's useful for this demo site that I'm demoing from, which is our demo site. You can find a link to that down in the video description as well. And it shows exactly the build that was used to show this demo site, because we're actively changing, we're actively iterating on things. So it is helpful for us to see that if you encountered an error on, in this case, it's build 577, that might not exist on build 578. We may have fixed it as part of as whatever we did between 577 and 578. So that's good information. So we're not, chasing our tails trying to fix something that it turns out we already fixed in a previous version. Another thing that's important, because Cortex is a web-based application, the URL is super important. So when you're sending screenshots of the Cortex application, please include the browser address bar. Now, I'm using Arc, so it's a little bit interesting. Arc kind of hides the address bar over here. Um, I can get to the URL here, so I can actually show you that I am at the root of the site, archivesdemo.colony.com/. That's it. I'm not at a sub page of the site. I am at basically the home page. So if I were going to share this with our support team, I might still provide a screenshot of the screen of the page itself, but I would share this URL. And Arc makes it super easy, just clicking this copy URL button. In Edge, in Chrome, the browser bar or the URL bar, the address bar is super prominent. Just copy what's there, or just include that in your screenshot. So with that, let me see if I can get this pop-up to go away. Try to get this pop-up to go away. There we go. I think it's good. Okay. Next up, I want to show, we're just going to pull up a business object form. Um, so we're in, this is Cortex for Sharewell. So I'm going to drill into a business object record. And let's say that something about this customer field isn't showing up properly. So obviously for reproduction steps, I would say I went to Cortex Archive. I clicked on the browse button. I opened incident. I opened the first one, completely arbitrarily. I might even say this happens on any incident I go to, because in this case, what I'm going to show you does happen on every incident. Um, Now, I will note this isn't actually a bug. I'm not showing you a real bug, but I'm showing you if there was something wrong with this particular control, how I would describe it. I would point out that this particular control, maybe I would take a screenshot of this page and draw a rectangle around it, or I would say in this screenshot where there is a customer field, Todd Morgan Maybe that's the right name. Let's just assume that's the right name. But this button over here, let's say this icon is wrong. Okay. So those are the reproduction steps. Now, we have to also include expected behavior and actual behavior. Actual behavior is, in this case, the screenshot, right? It very clearly shows that uh, this icon is showing up. And maybe the expected behavior is I expect uh, that this is it actually has a line through it, right? It's a different icon. It's somehow indicating that I can't view this customer because I don't have permissions or something like that. I'm just making stuff up at this point, just to prove a point. Uh, and that by itself would probably be enough for our support team to figure out what's going on. We would look at the configuration and probably see that there is some expression on this particular button, where in some cases it's supposed to show this icon, and in other cases it's supposed to show a different icon, right? And as it turns out, in that particular situation, the key point is that there are some situations where this icon is correct. There are some situations where this icon is incorrect. There is another icon that is showing up. And that gives us something that we can look for in the code and try to determine why this icon is always showing up, or at least always showing up for your specific user, and how we're not handling that properly. So on our end, it does end up being kind of a bit of detective work. But the more information you could give us, the better. You may not know all the information, and that is totally fine. You might not know that there is, an expression that means that sometimes you see one icon and sometimes you see a different icon, or you always see a different icon, but someone else always sees this icon. You might not know that, and that's totally fine. But if you provide as much information as possible about what you do know about the situation, it makes it so much easier for us to figure out what's going on. Now, that is what I described as case one of bugs, where it's everything appears to be working uh, stably with the system, but there is something that doesn't seem to be behaving quite right. Doesn't seem to be behaving quite right to you, right? You are seeing something different from what you expected to see. But the system certainly isn't crashing. Now, there is kind of a gray area between the two, where, especially with these archive systems that we're building, there is some configuration that sometimes we aren't exactly sure what it means or how we're supposed to be handling it. So in those cases, we do our best guess at what it's supposed to do, but we warn about it. And that kind of drifts into the second case of bugs and defects, where in order to be squarely in that second case, something has to blow up. Technical term. It doesn't actually blow up, but you get an error message, or in the case of some of these form controls, you'll see a red box on the screen where the control is supposed to show up, and we do that so that that uh, issue is isolated to that form control. So everything else on the page works totally fine. But if there's one specific thing that we're not handling properly, that's the only thing that isn't going to work. And we also provide logging on the kind of the back end, indicating that we had trouble rendering that control. We had trouble evaluating some expression for that control, or something else happened that in code we were not expecting, and we weren't able to continue. Now, in some of these cases, and this is why there's sort of a gray area, sometimes there's a bit of an expression that we have never seen before. It is unique to your database, and so we don't have the code to handle it. We, in our code, we are very defensive about that. And any situation where something unexpected occurs, we log it. We log, it's at the warning level, which will become relevant in just a second, so that you can provide information to us that indicates exactly what is being missed. Um, and where you see that is in the admin section. You can go to view logs. Now, you'll see this message here. It basically says I have it turned off. That's because in this demo environment, I don't want to have logs saving to the database and, growing the database immensely. But I can turn logs off. Should we store uh, logs to this table? Yes. And my recommendation would be that you choose the warning level because all of the error messages that indicate something is not being presented on the screen the way it's supposed to is either going to be at the warning level or the error level. Warning means that we saw there was some configuration in your system that we have never seen before. We don't know how to handle it. Error is basically we really have never seen this before. We expected the configuration to follow a specific pattern. Your configuration doesn't follow that pattern, but not in a way that we could have predicted at all. So we basically gave up. And that's when you'll see some of those red messages or error messages on the screen. If you see an error message on the screen, typically you'll also see a corresponding error in the logs. If something just maybe doesn't look right, you might see a warning indicating that there's configuration that we've just never seen before. So at this point, it's saved, and you can see that yellow banner goes away. At this point, I can go browse around. Maybe let's look at something I've never looked at before. Okay, great. Um, and in your case, this is something that you would uh, use during documenting the reproduction steps. So you would go back to the steps that you went through that led you to see the particular error. And then once you saw the error, I don't actually see any errors here, but then you'd go back to view logs and you would probably have some logs down here in this table. At this point, you can hit export logs. And one of the things this does is obviously it exports the logs. B, it includes some of the information that I mentioned down in this bottom left corner, which is off the screen here, about the version of Cortex that you're using. And at this point, that's basically it. We don't include any database information because we consider that sensitive, right? We don't want to know anything about your particular database, certainly nothing in your connection string. Um, but this export is just an XML file. It is readable. You can open it up in a text editor in Notepad or something like that, and you can see everything that's in there. So you can even see and verify that there is no sensitive information in there. Um, we don't log anything that we consider sensitive at the warning or error level or above. But if you get into some of the lower levels like info or debug or trace, you might have things like access tokens. If you're some of the things you can do in Cortex, depending on how you have it configured, talk to APIs. And in some cases, we might log those to the file. But in that case, you could certainly open up this XML file and remove anything that you consider sensitive, because most of the time that is not useful in uh, our debugging. It might be useful in your troubleshooting, but not for us. Um, yeah. So that's also a reason that I recommend not keeping this setting on all the time, so that when you export the logs, you're not dealing with a huge XML file that you need to pour through. If you run into an issue, turn on the logs, go reproduce the issue, turn off the logs, and then export them. So you just have the shortest set of logs that are relevant to the issue you were seeing. And then you can also delete all the logs. Once you've exported the logs, you can delete all of the logs so that they're no longer in the database. And the next time you run into an issue, you have a fresh table with nothing in it. You turn on logging, go reproduce the issue. Now the only things in that in this table are logs relevant to the particular issue that you were reproducing. So uh, with that, this is kind of the one-stop shop. We designed this specifically to allow you to basically do use Cortex the way you normally would use Cortex, and then just export a snapshot of things that would happen. Now, one other thing that I want to point out, which might be helpful in either situation, is uh, this current object values button up here. This is super helpful if there's a particular record that is misbehaving. Either case, either something is not showing up on the screen the way you expect it to be showing up, or something is crashing. There is an error message that you're seeing. Sometimes it's useful to have the actual example of uh, what is in the record. Now, there is very likely to be sensitive information in this record, which is why we don't uh, ask for your data ever. However, in some situations, there might be something related to, like I said, a specific record. So at that point, we'll have you go to the specific record and export the CSV of just this record's data. Now, this is a CSV, a true CSV. It is a single record CSV. So one row of column headers, one row of data. You can go through and remove anything that is sensitive, or you can use that as an example to pull into a dev system or a testing system, and create a record that is similar to the record in the system where you're experiencing an issue. Um, the advantage to this is that when we're reproducing an issue, we don't have to guess at the relationships between, service and category and some of the other things, or, what does, sometimes you have expressions that are built off of like these stat fields. So, we don't have to guess at what this value should be in order for a particular expression to show up. Again, of course, there might be sensitive information in here. So that's why we export this specifically as a text format so that you can edit it and remove or redact any of those sensitive details. I think that's pretty much it. We put a lot of effort into making sure that Cortex was really easy to troubleshoot. A lot of these tools we actually built for us initially as we were trying to debug and troubleshoot issues that we saw in example databases that we were working off of. Uh, but we didn't just want to be selfish about them and keep them for ourselves. We wanted to put them in the tool so that if you run into an issue, you can report that issue super quickly, super easily, and give us as much information as you possibly could, obviously with sensitive details removed, um, but so that you didn't have to work to try to replicate an issue or describe what you were running into. In a lot of situations, just by looking at the logs, we can identify what an issue is. In the last several months, I'd say there have only been maybe a handful of issues that I needed to go to the actual configuration, the actual some aspect of the database that we were running on, to figure out what was going on. Most of the time, the error, the warning, and the information contained in it, which is just information about the application itself, and the calls through the code and the things that it's trying to do, uh, without obviously any of the details of the actual configuration that it's operating on, has been sufficient to figure out what's going on. Um, so we have taken lots of steps to make sure that we are able to identify exactly what's going on, pinpoint exactly what's going on, make it easy for you to report to us what you are seeing and what you think is going on. and be able to solve these issues. So I know this video got really, really long. I hope this was helpful. Um, if it was, hit that thumbs up button. If you have other questions about how to report bugs for Cortex specifically or software in general, leave a comment down below. And with that, I will see you in the next one.